A day after levying steep new tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, U.S. President Donald Trump says Americans may feel some economic pain from his duties on key trading partners.
But he's vowed to keep them in place until what he describes as a national emergency over fentanyl and illegal immigration to the U.S. ends.
The move drew condemnation both at home and abroad after Canada and Mexico ordered retaliatory measures. China likewise vowed to take action.
Both Canada and China are readying suits to file at the World Trade Organization, challenging President Trump's tariffs. For more on this, let's speak now with Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. Deborah, thank you very much for joining us. Now, we know that tariff collections are set to begin on Tuesday, but given the high stakes and backlash both home and abroad, do you think there is still room for negotiations, or is this trade dispute basically a done deal?
I'm not sure what you would be negotiating over. You're talking in this case about fentanyl and migration. Whatever you think you can resolve in the next 24 hours is unlikely to move the needle. I think Trump wants to impose tariffs, and he plans to impose them as soon as Tuesday.
Deborah, Canada and Mexico have said this very clearly. They don't want it. And Donald Trump himself admitting Americans could feel the pain. I want to go back to that particular point. Is it clear what Justin Trudeau and Claudia Sheinbaum have to do to avoid this trade war? Because we know that order contains no mechanisms. It doesn't have any benchmarks apart from those broad goals of migrant crossings and fentanyl. And, he's even said, Donald Trump, that is, has even said that he isn't looking for any concessions.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is your instinct is to negotiate, right? To find some sort of mutually acceptable solution to whatever the problem is to avoid this kind of economic pain. But what would that look like? Especially if you're Canada. So let's think about Canada and fentanyl for just a second. The U.S. Customs and Border Patrol declares that they have found 19 kilograms, 19, less than 20, worth of fentanyl over the whole of last year at the border with Canada. How in the world would you show a reduction in 20 kilos worth of a product across a year? There isn't any measure that you can come up with. So I think the challenge here is, what are you negotiating over? And even if you negotiate something, let's just remember that U.S., Canada, and Mexico have had an agreement in place for decades that has been violated by these actions by the United States. So not only is it not clear what you would negotiate over, but even if you got an agreement, does it matter if the U.S. can rip up the agreement that you have at any moment?
So let's talk about this agreement that they have. They want to talk about the future of the USMCA, especially if this trade war is not resolved soon. Trump has proposed reviewing this USMCA this year. And do you think this is going to be even useful at all, since the trade war basically goes against this trade agreement? Or do you think that USMCA can sort of help the three countries find an alternative trade agreement, perhaps?
Well, any trade agreement only works if the parties in the trade agreement are prepared to let it constrain their behavior. That's how trade agreements work. You have enforcement mechanisms, you have dispute settlement, but at the end of the day, it requires the parties to want it to work. And in the case of USMCA, it's not clear that the United States under Donald Trump want USMCA to work. And so I'm not sure what good it will do to renegotiate USMCA. We already have it in place. It is supposed to prevent exactly this kind of behavior, a sudden imposition of 25% tariffs across the board. That's sort of the bedrock issue of USMCA. So I don't even know why we're really talking about this anymore. It seems to me the United States has just ripped up USMCA overnight and then has declared, let's talk about maybe where we go from here. But even then, it's not obvious that Trump wants to make a deal.
So, Deborah, given the intertwined nature of global supply chains and also global trade, are you fearful that this could lead to a wider global trade war? Does Trump have Europe in his sights next?
I think this is extremely alarming, both for North American production, which is so integrated that literally chicken and egg production is back and forth between U.S., Canada, and Mexico at the state of eggs and chickens. And so when you say, well, everything from chickens and eggs through automobiles and so forth are integrated, and you've ripped up this agreement, that is going to cause tremendous pain for supply chains that run across North America. But it also is a powerful signal to the rest of the world that the United States is prepared to do extraordinarily unusual things in order to, as Trump says, make America great again. And so, yes, I think there are other countries in his sights. He's already threatened the European Union with upcoming tariffs later on in February. So I think this is only the beginning of what Trump intends to be a much broader assault on what he sees as unfair trade practices by the rest of the world towards the United States.
Deborah, you talked about the pains, but while the trade wars typically highlight the negative impacts, there are also winners, right? I mean, what sort of industries or countries do you think could benefit and capitalize on these shifts and trade disruptions?
Well, I think Asia has been kind of pleased in a way, because under Trump 1, Asia did particularly well, especially places like Vietnam, where exports to the United States boomed as a result of restrictions on trade with China. I think it is a mistake to think that Trump 2 is going to be as benign for Asia. I suspect that after they have started imposing these tariffs against Canada, Mexico, China, and they move on to the European Union, for example, it will become much harder for firms across Asia to use inputs from China, potentially Canada and Mexico, to export to the United States. And so I think while Asia's currently feeling pretty relaxed about many of these actions, the consequences are going to be pretty severe as well for any firms that are trying to trade with the United States. And although the U.S. is no longer the largest importer for most of the markets in this region, China's become the largest market for most of the countries in this region, I think it's going to be a problem for integrated supply chains for a region that has built itself on export-led growth to continue forward when the largest player has decided that the rules no longer matter.
Right. I want to look at China in particular. China, Trump seems to be approaching China with a bit more caution, 10% tariffs. I mean, he's talked bigger numbers early on during his campaign. What do you read of this? Does he acknowledge China's power? Is he trying to use a softer approach? There's a lot of talk about how he's trying to, work out his relationship with Xi Jinping. And also, whether you think this softer touch will continue, or is this just a start and we could actually see those harsher tariffs come into play later on?
I think it's a little unclear, but let's remember that the 10% tariffs on China are on top of existing tariffs. So while Canada and Mexico currently have no tariffs and just jumped to 25%, China across the board is facing 20% tariffs into the United States ahead of this new 10%. So now it's 30% tariffs on most Chinese goods into the United States. So that's, first of all, fairly significant. But it is unclear what is Trump's own attitude vis-a-vis China. And I find it striking that through almost the entire campaign, he never mentioned China. Now, that's very different from his first administration, when he spent most of his time talking about China and very little time talking about everywhere else. This time, he's talked mostly Canada, Panama, Greenland, Mexico, European Union. He's mentioned China very little. But I will say that his cabinet, particularly Marco Rubio and others, are much more China hawks than I think Trump is. And so the tension in his cabinet over what to do vis-a-vis China could be reflected in part in this 10% tariffs on China now, with the thought that it could escalate in the future, or there may be some kind of deal to be made with China.
Deborah, I just want to go back to another campaign promise he made, and that is that inflation will come down, prices, will come down. Right now, we know that, Trump and his allies are insisting, tariffs are not going to raise prices, and they cite his first term as an example. I mean, what is the reality for this round, this new round in his second term? Is it going to be the same? Are prices still going to come down and stay low?
No, we've got higher inflation ahead. And I think even Trump is starting to admit that. So you'll notice that, one of his tweets as a result of this said, that there may be pain for the United States, or maybe not, as a result of these tariffs, but it's worth it. So I think the argument is now shifting to say, if we have higher prices, which is we will, if we have more inflation, which we will, then we have a sort of short-term pain, but it's worth it for the long-term consequences. And then it should lead everyone to say, what long-term consequences? What is it that we get out of this? And in fact, again, let's think about the ostensive rationale for the tariffs is certainly on Canada, Mexico, and China at this time is migration and fentanyl. Again, it's not clear that tariffs are going to result in changes in migration and fentanyl. But even if it did, I think consumers in the United States might be questioning whether or not whatever pain they're feeling at the grocery store, for example, is worth the changes to migration and fentanyl policy.
Deborah, I'm a bit confused. What do you think Trump wants ultimately? I mean, is he trying to force diplomatic change? Is he trying to eliminate trade deficits? Or is he trying to raise revenues? And they aren't necessarily compatible at the same time.
I think part of the reason you're confused is that he's trying to do a lot of things all at once, and they're incompatible goals. So as you mentioned, it's about raising revenue, which he thinks is going to help offset tax cuts. It's about showing U.S. power, which clearly is happening. It's about reshuffling supply chains. So he usually follows up a statement about tariffs with, if you make it in the United States, you won't be subject to these tariffs. So that suggests that what you could do instead is set up factories and operations in the U.S. and make whatever it is in the U.S., except that there are lots of rules that make it difficult for inbound investment, especially from China, that are going to probably be tightened. So again, I think we have contradictory impulses in Trump himself. We certainly have contradictory impulses across Trump's cabinet. And so the reason that you're confused, I think, is that we're using this tool called tariffs to solve, or at least to attempt to solve, a whole variety of problems that not all of which are obvious, many of which are in conflict, and most of them won't be solved by tariffs.
All right, Deborah, we do have to leave it there. We thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. Deborah Elms is Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation.